Start the next session, which is a logical continuation of the first plenary session. In fact, Minister Lavrov has also mentioned some things that have to do with this. That is nuclear non-proliferation regime, potential impact of the treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons. In the first session, Madam Nakamitsu has mentioned the fact that the new treaty is a part of the non-proliferation regime, and that is the view of the United Nations. Ambassador Timurbayev has published an interview in Arms Control Today magazine and also in the Nuclear Club magazine. In that article, the author stated that in the future, when the time comes, the nuclear ban treaty should replace a non-proliferation regime. In fact, this would be a new regime. But according to Ambassador Timurbayev, the time has not come for that yet. So we should walk in that direction steadily, step by step. In the expert environment, there are various attitudes to this, various views on the subordination of these treaties, the NPT and the new nuclear ban treaty. So now I would like to pass the floor to the Director of the Department for Non-Proliferation and Arms Control at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Ambassador Ulyanov. I have recently been asked to speak on the issue of nuclear ban treaty in different audiences, and I am quite uncomfortable talking about it because this treaty is a product of negotiations of a large group of countries. There are many friendly countries in that group. We understand that negotiations participants were led by a goal of building a nuclear-free world. We are very positive about such aspirations, but we still believe that those countries have been on the wrong path. The NPT treaty says that complete elimination of nuclear weapons should happen within the context of a treaty on full and complete disarmament. That is the late paragraph in the preamble. There's also Article 6. We have a concern that a new treaty would have a negative impact on non-proliferation regime. I can tell you specifically what makes us concerned. The treaty switches attention from the main task, that is building conditions when nuclear disarmament process could continue, to a different secondary subject. The treaty advocates think that the treaty can accelerate new arrangements, new agreements on reduction of nuclear arsenals. I think there is no ground for such expectations. Not for the United States, not for Russia, not for other nuclear states. For all these countries, security considerations play the biggest role, and today international environment is not favorable for new agreements. Although certainly we should continue to make attempts to agree. For a number of years we've been urging people to create conditions that would help come to new agreements, but not many people have heard us, and that continues to be the case. Secondly, the nuclear ban treaty increases the gap between its advocates and those who are not ready to join it yet. 2/3 of countries have participated, 1/3 of countries has not. How many countries are going to join this treaty? I don't know. Maybe we're going to see 50-50 ratio. In any situation, we see an increasing gap, which adds to other problems that we see in the international landscape today. There are some statements in that treaty that concern us. I can name 3. The treaty proclaims its priority with regard to other international treaties. Article 18 says that this treaty shall not impact countries' commitments with regard to other treaties if they are in line with the nuclear ban treaty. Who's going to decide on that? I guess the authorities, the government of every country. Would it impact NPT? Theoretically, yes, it can. They have Article 4. It says that an international body should be put together to conduct verifications of nuclear disarmament. I guess many colleagues are tempted to give this function to IAEA. This can really make the agency collapse. They are not designed to perform this function. It's not in the charter. It's not in any other documents. And I very much hope that nobody is going to make experiments in this domain, and nobody is going to impose these functions on IAEA. I'm also concerned and curious about Article 17, which suggests that there is a possibility to exit this treaty. I cannot imagine this happening. If it happens, though, especially that is relevant to non-nuclear states, we are going to end up with another serious problem of international nature. I guess I have used up my time. So in conclusion, let me say a few positive things. Frankly, we expected this treaty to be worse than it turned out to be. Negotiation participants have shown a higher level of responsibility. They did not get into the things that the Open Working Group has looked at. They did not try to impose any extra commitments on nuclear states. That is a welcome thing. Thank you. Thank you very much, Mikhail. Thank you for a clear, concise statement. Our next presenter is John Carlson, a non-resident fellow at Lowy Institute for International Policy, Australia. Many of us know John through his work in the Safeguards Agency in many different capacities. For many years, John has been with this organization, and it has actually changed its title several times during that period. Over to you, John.
Thank you very much, Anton. Good morning, dear colleagues. First, I'd like to very briefly express my appreciation to CENESS for the opportunity to be at this conference and to exchange views with so many dear colleagues and friends. In addressing the question of the ban treaty, I think it's necessary to consider what prompted the treaty in the first place. And essentially, this was anger, it's not too strong a word, by the non-nuclear weapon states about the lack of action on nuclear disarmament. Article 6 of the NPT requires parties to pursue negotiations in good faith on effective measures for ceasing the nuclear arms race at an early date and for nuclear disarmament. Today, the nuclear weapon states are ignoring this obligation. There is no sense of any commitment to the Article 6 obligations. There are no negotiations current or planned, and a number of actions, such as so-called modernisation programs, the discussion of new missions and new designs for nuclear weapons, and more recently, veiled threats to use nuclear weapons, are all inconsistent with any sense that the weapon states might have that they should actually be on a path towards disarmament. The nuclear weapon states say that a step-by-step approach to disarmament is needed, but today no such steps seem to be in prospect. The ban treaty itself, unfortunately, in my view, is poorly conceived and very badly drafted, and could well cause damage to the non-proliferation regime. But a greater cause of damage will be continued failure to take meaningful steps on arms reductions and disarmament. Such steps are needed not just to meet the expectations of the non-nuclear weapon states, they are very much in the interest of the nuclear weapon states themselves. The ban treaty is poorly conceived. It's divisive. The proponents deliberately decided against a treaty which could include weapon states unless they were prepared to disarm immediately, which is clearly impossible, and exclude states that are subject to a nuclear umbrella unless they renounce these. It is clearly unrealistic to expect disarmament by a set date. The circumstances with nuclear weapons are totally different to those with chemical weapons or landmines. However, an inclusive approach would have sought common ground. For instance, nuclear weapon states may well have been prepared, after some reflection, to give a firm commitment to disarm, combined with something like a no first use or sole purpose declaration. I think a treaty that approached the issue that way could have been actually extremely valuable. The ban treaty is badly drafted, particularly in the area of safeguards. It contradicts NPT review conference decisions that safeguards must be rigorous and universal, specifically that the IAEA safeguards additional protocol must apply to all states. Instead, the treaty sets two different safeguard standards. For former nuclear weapon states, the additional protocol will apply. For non-nuclear weapon states, the protocol does not apply unless a state has a protocol when the treaty enters into force. There are a number of states of proliferation concern or proliferation interest that do not have additional protocols, and under the ban treaty, that could be their permanent state. They don't have additional protocols. The strongest possible non-proliferation regime is absolutely essential to achieving disarmament. A treaty that fails to provide a rigorous and universal safeguard standard will fail to provide the confidence needed for disarmament to proceed. The treaty's differentiation on safeguard standards is counterproductive to this and damages the NPT's objectives. It is unclear how the relationship between the ban treaty and the NPT will be managed. Ban treaty parties form a sizable group of NPT parties, potentially a two-thirds majority. It is essential that they do not exploit their numbers to damage the NPT. Some have suggested that some states may start to leave the NPT. I don't see any sign of that, but it's a worrying thought. It is essential for all NPT parties to recognise the importance of a strong non-proliferation regime. Without this, disarmament will be impossible. So what can be done to minimise the damage? Nuclear weapon states and the non-NPT nuclear arms states need to initiate negotiations and actions for a stepwise approach. Russia and the US, as has already been mentioned this morning, should extend New START and initiate consultations on what I'd call START 4 and on de-alerting and on other risk mitigation steps. All the nuclear armed states should work together to establish a multilateral process which would cover all of them, to act as a forum for addressing confidence-building measures, clarification of doctrines, communication channels, the issues raised by ballistic missile defence, and all the various other issues that are so important to disarmament efforts. The weapons states and nuclear arms states should acknowledge the commitment to disarm. They should end modernisation programs and put aside ideas of developing mini-nukes and other new classes of weapons. They should consider issuing no first use and sole purpose declarations. Some nuclear arms states have already established no first use as their national policy. There should be a process of agreeing to ceilings and progressive reductions. They need to cooperate fully on dealing with proliferation challenges, such as those on the Korean Peninsula. And they must act together to address nuclear latency issues and to bring the CTBT into force. Particularly important in view of the poor drafting of the ban treaty, it's important that all states work together to promote conclusion of safeguards additional protocols through the IAEA and also through condition of nuclear supply. States joining the ban treaty should make strong statements in support of the additional protocol when they join. And finally, high priority must be given to improving the political awareness of the value of the NPT. Those who are supporters of the NPT should take every opportunity to improve the understanding of the NPT's value at a leadership level, going over the top of perhaps some of the bureaucrats who are less committed to the NPT. And on that note, I'll finish. I'll just mention that I have a couple of articles on these topics, and I'll arrange the links to those to be circulated. Thank you very much.
Спасибо, Джон, особенно за...
Thank you, John. Thank you for your assessment of the treaty, especially with regard to use of safeguards. I think many of you know that John Carlson has been specialized on safeguards on a national level. He's been coordinating Australian national policies, and he's been playing an important role in IAEA in coordination of several countries' efforts for the agency's safeguards strengthening. Our next presenter is William Potter, the director at James Martin Center for Non-Proliferation Studies. Sam Nunn and Richard Lugar, Professor of Non-Proliferation Studies at Middlebury Institute of International Studies at Monterey, my good friend and colleague.
Center in this conference, but since you've given us such a short time to speak, I'm going to omit that praise at the moment, and instead turn my attention to the topic at hand. As I've written elsewhere on the origins of the ban treaty, the politics surrounding the treaty are complex, with many storylines, characters, and subplots. And much like Kurosawa's famous film Rashomon, the heroes and villains look very different depending on one's vantage point, be that of a nuclear weapons possessor, ally of the United States, other nuclear, non-nuclear weapon states, advocates of nuclear abolition, or proponent of nuclear deterrence. Personally, I am agnostic about the value added or detracted by the treaty with respect to disarmament and non-proliferation, but I don't believe it's very productive at this session or at this moment in time to debate the merits and demerits of the treaty, which almost certainly will enter into force well before the 2020 NPT Review Conference. I also don't believe it's helpful to question the motivations of its negotiators, especially as those most inclined to do so boycotted the treaty's negotiations this past year, and as importantly, also boycotted the open-ended working group in 2016, which gave rise to the UN resolution mandating the negotiation of a treaty, opportunities at which critics could have influenced the subsequent course of events. What does merit serious examination is how the conclusion of the ban treaty within the next year or two will impact on the nuclear non-proliferation regime in general and the NPT review process in particular. More specifically, will it lead to the unraveling of the NPT, as some of the critics suggest, and will it give rise to more rampant proliferation? Although I have very little time to provide much nuance in my response to these questions, my short answer to both questions is no, at least not necessarily. First, there is no objective reason why the existence of the new treaty, flaws and all, should significantly affect the health of the NPT, which, as many of you should be aware, was fractured on many fronts well before the ban treaty was conceived. In this regard, it's useful to recall that the NPT regime has almost always appeared to be in a precarious position. That was the prevailing perception before 1995, 2000, and even more so in 2005. The failure to forge a consensus document at the 2015 NPT RevCon again has elicited much hand-wringing about the increased fragility of the NPT, the potential for its unraveling, and the likely surge in proliferation. And while the forecast of impending doom may be true this time round, it's certainly not a new forecast. Witness the wildly exaggerated forecasts in the past. As many of you who know me are aware, I'm not an optimist at heart, and that applies to the future of the non-proliferation regime. However, I am a realist enough to recognize that the NPT has demonstrated very considerable resilience over time, and we should not overinterpret signs of its impending unraveling. That being said, if NPT states parties come to the 2018 PrepCom in Geneva this April with a view to scoring debating points about the virtues and liabilities of the treaty and the motivations of its critics and defenders, it's unlikely to be a pretty scene. In fact, one can even imagine the scenario in which a bad situation is made much worse, leading conceivably even to a walkout by some disgruntled parties along the lines of what occurred by one state in 2013. So in order to avoid that situation, in my view, it behooves both nuclear weapon states, their allies, and non-nuclear weapon states, proponents of the ban treaty, to take a number of steps, and I'll mention two. First, it would be highly desirable if the nuclear weapon states and their allies accept the fact that a ban treaty almost certainly will enter into force in the not-too-distant future and will be ratified by many of those who participated in its negotiation. As my CNS colleague Andrea Berger has observed, this means that realist critics of the treaty will need to come to grips with the fact that the ban will, for the foreseeable future, be part of the international legal architecture for disarmament. As she also observes, sternly worded condemnations of the treaty are not going to make it go away or reduce its potential negative effect. As such, critics will be advised to, in my view, invest their energies in mitigating the perceived shortcomings of the treaty, especially as they apply to international safeguards. First and foremost, this means acting collectively to accelerate the adoption of the additional protocol as the international verification standard. And in this regard, I fully agree with a similar point made in the paper by Ambassador Berdennikov that was the focus of discussion earlier this morning. Also indispensable is the need for nuclear weapon states and their allies to develop a meaningful alternative agenda for nuclear disarmament and risk reduction, And here I think a good starting point might be agreement on minimum measurable steps for implementing Action 5 of the 2010 NPT Review Conference, something that was addressed by Ambassador Laughner, among others, this morning. And I might add that most of these steps were also present in the President's draft of the 2007, or rather 15 RevCon, which ultimately was not adopted. But I think to this list, one certainly should add renewed efforts to bring the CTBT into force. By the same token, proponents of the ban treaty, having succeeded in achieving their primary objective, should take to heart their oft-stated declarations during the March negotiations in New York, which were somewhat less evident in June and July, that the NPT is the cornerstone of the international non-proliferation regime, and that the new treaty must build on and strengthen the NPT rather than replace it. Among other things, that means returning to the tough business of improving international safeguards, enhancing verification, and addressing non-proliferation compliance, as well as devoting far more energy than they have to date to addressing that part of the open-ended working group mandate which dealt with nuclear risk reduction. My second and last point deals with the demise of U.S.-Russian cooperation for non-proliferation. In fact, I'm much more concerned about the negative impact on the non-proliferation regime and the health of the NPT due to the continuing decline in U.S.-Russian relations than I am about the effects of the ban treaty. In this respect, I believe it's critical to recall the very positive history of U.S.-Soviet as well as U.S.-Russian cooperation for non-proliferation, and how central that cooperation was to both the NPT and the broader non-proliferation regime. As Ambassador Roland Timirbayev observes in a recent interview in Arms Control Today, and I quote Ambassador Timirbayev, "The change in attitude toward nuclear weapons and the idea of signing the NPT had much to do with the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis. Given the loss of institutional memory in both countries of arms control and non-proliferation cooperation, and an atmosphere of extreme distrust, we can't afford another Cuban Missile Crisis to restore sanity to our bilateral relations, in part because we can't assume that it would have a peaceful resolution." Thank you.
Спасибо, Bill.
Thanks a lot, Bill. The next to speak will be Dr. Oliver Meyer, Deputy Head at the Research Division on International Security from the German Institute for International and Security Affairs. Oliver?
Thank you, Anton, and thank you for inviting me to speak on this panel at what is really a very impressive conference, I must say. Let me maybe start off topic, actually, even though we have very limited time, and congratulate Russia on the completion of the destruction of its chemical weapons stockpile, which was achieved at the end of last month. I think this is a very good demonstration of what we can achieve towards a world free of weapons of mass destruction if we have strong institutions, if these institutions are given the freedom to expand on their mandate, and if there is a political dedication to achieving a world free of weapons of mass destruction. On the topic at hand of this panel, which is the potential impact of the ban treaty on the regime for the non-proliferation of nuclear weapons, let me start out by addressing maybe the potential in the title. And I would take sides with those on the first panel today and on this panel who think we have moved beyond the potential, actually, and that there will be an impact of the ban treaty on the regime because it has broad international support. It resonates with the public in many countries, including in Germany, And clearly the treaty will enter into force in the not too distant future, which will make it a legal point of reference. The question then is really, that has been addressed already to some degree, what the impact is likely to be. And I would take maybe a slightly different take than John Carlson and not talk so much about minimizing the damage to the non-proliferation regime, but rather about maximizing the potential impact of the treaty for the non-proliferation regime. And the main point I would like to make is now that the treaty has been open for signature, that the international campaign to abolish nuclear weapons has received the Nobel Peace Prize. It's maybe a good time actually to relax a little bit and move beyond the sometimes hostile statements of both sides of the debate about the value of the ban treaty and engage in debate at how we can make best use of this new international instrument to strengthen the NPT and move forward and see how we can use that. Clearly, it's difficult to judge the impact of the ban treaty because it's a novel kind of agreement to some degree. It's a hybrid accord, a mix of different types of international instruments that we have, of arms control, disarmament, humanitarian arms control types of instruments. And this mix, as has been said, is not the result of some grand strategy, but to some degree, I think the outcome of negotiations that were conducted and concluded in some haste. This haste has also led to a lack of definitions of some key terms and concepts in the treaty, which is problematic. And John has already mentioned some of the problems in this regard, with regard to safeguards. There are other problems with regard to potential overlap with the CTBT. Article 18 has been mentioned, and the overall question of relation to other international agreements by previous speakers. Clearly, those are our problems, but the ambiguity in some of the terms and definitions could also be a positive thing in that it enables both ban treaty opponents and supporters to engage in a dialogue on finding meanings to these terms and concepts that sit well with the NPT. And that, I think, would be an opportunity to engage on some of these issues. Overall, I have to say, I think the ban treaty will have a positive impact on the NPT and can have a positive impact on the NPT. And that is because looking at nuclear disarmament only from a security perspective has turned out to be insufficient if we want to move towards a world free of nuclear weapons. While it is true that security considerations have to be taken into account, quite often the lack of conditions for nuclear disarmament is used as an excuse not to engage seriously on steps towards a world free of nuclear weapons. And quite often the nuclear weapon states themselves are engaged in creating these very obstacles by heightening nuclear tensions, by improving nuclear arsenals, or by fostering regional or international tensions. So I think the ban treaty can play a very useful role by broadening discussions on the value of nuclear deterrence in maintaining international security. The ban treaty supporters have successfully and I think usefully highlighted that any militarily meaningful use of nuclear weapons would be inconsistent with international humanitarian law. And I think bringing in this humanitarian dimension highlights some of the security dilemmas associated with nuclear deterrence that nuclear weapon states like to brush under the carpet sometimes. So how can we realize the positive impact of the ban treaty? And I want to briefly talk about three groups of states that are part of this debate: the nuclear weapon states, the ban treaty supporters, and a group in the middle that are neither nuclear weapon states nor are they real ban treaty supporters. For the nuclear weapon states, clearly the task at hand is to begin to implement the step-by-step approach that they themselves argue is a better approach than the humanitarian approach. And the agenda here has been mentioned quite often. I think it needs to be derived from the agreements at the review conferences, not necessarily only from the treaty text itself. I think that's the purpose of the review conferences, to elaborate and have an evolution of the commitments contained in the treaty. And clearly we have the practical steps agreed in 2000 and the action plan in 2010 as guidelines here. And if you go through the list of measures agreed there, unfortunately the balance sheet is not very positive, and we can go into that in the Q&A maybe. For the ban treaty supporters, I think the task at hand is to shift from campaign mode, if you like, into a mode to promote a dialogue with some of the nuclear weapon states. And unfortunately, I think the you are with us or against us approach that may have been useful in promoting the treaty and bringing countries to the table at the negotiating table has been counterproductive to some degree, particularly in those states like Germany that sympathize with the ban treaty goal, but have problems of joining the negotiations, of course, and definitely signing on to the treaty because it is incompatible with their alliance commitments. The effect this you're with us or against us approach has had sometimes is that it has polarized the domestic debates on these issues also, and it has weakened arms control and non-proliferation constituencies within the countries. So the third group of states that I think is important in this regard is this group of countries that sits in the middle between ban treaty supporters and opponents. This includes countries that have participated in the negotiations but had reservations about the treaty itself. The Netherlands broke consensus by voting against the treaty, but countries like Sweden and Switzerland also voiced reservations about some of the key aspects of the treaty itself. On the other side, we had countries that, again, were sympathetic to the idea but could not join the negotiations and certainly not the treaty because they are in alliances with nuclear weapon states, and particularly the United States. Germany was one of these countries. Japan is another one. I think these and other like-minded states could take the initiative to address some of the ambivalences and shortcomings of the ban treaty, as well as tensions and contradictions between the ban treaty and the NPT. To this effect, they could launch similar initiatives in different fora to help, for example, to define the definitions of key terms in the treaty, including threat of use, assistance, Article 18, the relationship with the IAEA, and other topics that are problematic. I have suggested to call this group Friends of the Nuclear Order, but there could certainly be other names that might be useful or labels that could be used. To conclude, let me just say, for this positive scenario to happen, I think it would be useful if both sides of the debate take a deep breath, relax, and engage seriously on the meaning of nuclear deterrence and nuclear prohibition after the ban treaty has been concluded. Thanks very much.
Спасибо, Оливер.
Oliver, thank you very much. We've got exactly 30 minutes to ask questions and to get answers and responses. Please indicate your willingness to ask questions. Ambassador Bazzano first, then Victor Mizin. Please. Thank you. Thank you very much to all the panelists. Some very important issues you raised, gentlemen. I think that this new treaty, this nuclear ban treaty, despite all its limitations, and these are many, opens up a new page, or even a new chapter, a non-proliferation and a nuclear disarmament. And this is something we should be mindful of. At the same time, it is a reflection of the global developments and processes we witness nowadays. That is when international decision-making centers also grow in number. We see more and more such centers appearing. In fact, more and more countries now have appetite to make decisions based on this. Now, humanitarian approach is a very good approach because it allows to mobilize a lot of countries and the masses of the working people to achieve noble goals. However, this approach alone is insufficient to ensure irreversibility of the process and sustainability of outcomes. There are many other parameters having to do with security that must be taken into consideration if we're serious about nuclear disarmament. Okay, what about your question? I will ask my question. I'm coming to it. Now, when you mentioned demerits and liabilities, you talked about verification and control, and this is something what Mr. Ulyanov and Mr. Carlson mentioned, but I don't quite understand how the two fit together. Ambassador Ulyanov mentioned that IAEA is in our position to be a body to look after this treaty. Well, if IAEA deals with assurances and safeguards only, well, IAEA is well positioned to do this. They have all the tools at their disposal. However, how can we guarantee non-nuclear state of the various states using just IAEA safeguards? But this is more of a comment, not a question. No, in the end, there was a question. I'm sorry. And my question obviously goes to Ambassador Ulyanov and John Carlson. Dr. Mizin, a question, please. I'm Dr. Mizin from Kima. I've got a question to Ambassador Ulyanov. I had the pleasure of knowing him for many years. Now, if we look at this treaty in the broader context of arms control, and we heard some brilliant presentations today, including the presentation done by Minister Lavrov. Well, it's clear that we seem to be in a dead end. No single nuclear state would be willing to observe the treaty or comply with the treaty. The same goes for many non-nuclear states. There are many areas that are adjacent to the treaty. I'm referring to strategic arms control and others. We seem to be in dead ends. Now, in order to avoid the state of panic, now, what might be the areas where we could hope for some more optimistic developments, where we could hope for some advance, so that not to be overtaken by gloom, especially in our run-up to 2020. Thank you. Dr. Kozin then, and then we'll give a chance to panelists to respond. Thank you very much. I got just one practical suggestions, although I did want to speak about demerits of the treaty, but a lot has been said already, so my contribution is unlikely to change anything because the treaty is not very good. However, my suggestion is very simple. Look, the treaty itself, even if it were supported by 100% of the countries in the world, would never take off the ground unless the offensive nuclear doctrines continue to be in place. We somewhat touched upon the issue of non-use of nuclear weapons for the first strike. I suggest a new, different measure, not so radical a measure, but something that corresponds to this now first use commitment. Perhaps Russians could agree with the Americans to switch to defensive and conditional nuclear deterrence doctrine. Now, this defensive doctrine is followed by Russia, but in a nutshell, the U.S. has an offensive doctrine. It's very dangerous, especially under the current conditions, when the previous administration and the current administration declared that they may use nuclear weapons on a limited scope, and there are some nukes with reduced yield that could be employed for this. Thank you. Thank you very much. Now let us hear from our panelists. Let's start with Ambassador Ulyanov, and then we'll get back to the Q&A session, please. Now, as to the first step, something Mr. Mizin asked about, I think it is obvious that the simplest
way to move forward would be to reach an agreement on another extension for the START, for the next 5-year extension. This is something that the language of the START provides, and we don't seem to be allergic to considering this issue, considering this possibility. However, to do this, we have to have an interested and a devoted partner, and this is what we are lacking at the moment. Whether such a partner appears after the U.S. completes the review of its politics, and its policy, actually, this remains to be seen. As to the question posed by Mr. Basanov, maybe my interpretation of the NPT treaty is somewhat different. As far as I understand, according to the NPT, if, say, a nuclear state decides to join the treaty, it will have to sign a comprehensive agreement with the IAEA on safeguards, and also, together with a competent international body, which is not existent yet, such countries should come up with a program to ensure verification of its disarmament. I mean, this is what I see in the treaty. This is how I interpret it. Thank you. I'm done. John?
Thank you, Anton. I'd like to address 2 points. First, on the safeguards issue, of course, in the case of non-nuclear weapon states, normal safeguards would apply, where clearly the IAEA has authority. It's a question of what safeguard standard would apply. The additional protocol is clearly the most effective form of safeguards. The ban treaty sort of compromises that. I'd suggest that parties to the ban treaty that don't or states that are considering becoming parties that don't currently have an additional protocol could demonstrate their good faith by concluding an additional protocol without further delay. As to the question of the IAEA's role for nuclear weapon states, I have a different perspective to Ambassador Ulyanov. The IAEA statute allows the agency to apply safeguards, or verification, if you like, in a broader sense, at the request of states, at the request of parties. So it's open to nuclear weapon states to approach the IAEA and say, we would like the IAEA to verify disarmament steps. It's a matter that can be done under the statute, and I don't think we need to discuss the merits or otherwise of it here, but I think it's certainly open for the IAEA to be given that role if parties so desire. Finally, on the question of a defensive deterrence posture, I think that really substantiates the point I was making before, that if the negotiators of the ban treaty had thought of it in terms of can the treaty be used to promote the notion of no first use, for instance, that this is within the realms of possibility for all of the nuclear weapon states to consider. Some of them already have such a posture, and for others it's not very far removed from their current posture. I think this would have been possible, and it would certainly be an enormous boost to attitudes on disarmament if all the weapon states were prepared to issue declarations of that kind today. Thank you.
Professor Potter.
Thank you, Anton. Although I think there were no questions directed specifically at me, I do want to weigh in on the whole question of safeguards. And I count myself in the camp of those who would have preferred a stronger set of provisions regarding safeguards in the ban treaty. But I must observe in this august setting that some of the critics of the ban treaty with respect to safeguards, in my view, are being disingenuous, given other safeguard provisions that are part and parcel of the history of the NPT review process, including the principles and objectives from 1995 in paragraph 12 in particular, which is very explicit about the conditions of nuclear trade with countries lacking full-scope safeguards. Proponents of safeguards also would do well to look at the legally binding provisions of a number of nuclear weapons-free zone treaties, including, I might add, Australia, who appear to disregard explicit prohibitions on nuclear trade with a particular country in South Asia lacking full-scope safeguards. So if we're going to criticize the ban treaty in this regard, let's also recall provisions that most countries in this room who are supportive of the NPT also agreed to in 1995 and 2000 and subsequently.
Oliver, do you have a comment, please?
Very briefly on the question of how do we get out of the dead end that we seem to be in, and the no first use question. I do think nuclear doctrines are a useful topic to engage in, a necessary topic, because there seem to be a lot of misperceptions about the nuclear doctrines and the possibility to use nuclear weapons. So that's something that urgently both sides need to engage in. Just to mention that Germany is one of the countries in Geneva that's fostering a dialogue on negative security assurances and how those can be institutionalized. I think that may be one useful context in which the nuclear weapon states could move further, and if they were to move towards a no first use posture or a sole purpose posture, that would certainly be very useful in reducing tensions in this regard. On the nuclear arms control side, I just briefly want to add to the necessity to extend the New START treaty that the INF treaty is the bigger part of the problem, I think, at the moment. And if I understood Minister Lavrov correctly, there's a Russian willingness to engage. I don't quite understand the argument that the allegations are so unspecific that it's impossible to clarify them, because the latest U.S. compliance report does at least mention the level of specificity of the allegations that I think it should be possible to respond to that. On the other hand, one of the areas that Russia is concerned about, missile defenses in Europe, NATO and the United States, I think, has in principle signaled a willingness to engage on confidence-building measures to make sure that, to address some of the Russian concerns that cruise missiles could be deployed at some of the Aegis shore sites in Europe. So there seems to be room to maneuver here, and that seems to be an urgent topic, I think, that we need to address in addition to extending New START. Thanks very much.
Оливер, в моем списке 6 человек.
I got 6 individuals on the list willing to ask questions. I think we'll have time for 4 questions only. Okay, 1 minute. Ambassador Sultani first, then General Yesin, Dr. Maria Sultan, and Angela Kane.
Thank you very much, Press, for the discussion. I'm telling my personal opinion, of course. One of the serious negative consequences of ban treaty was to in fact put in archive all attempts for decades that we have all made non-nuclear weapon states for nuclear weapon convention in Geneva, CD, and everywhere. Now it is in archive, and that was a negative sequence without questioning the good intention of the proponents. But I was very unhappy about it because now nobody is talking about nuclear weapon convention. So the positive thing was it drew the curtain, and those who were claiming that they are really towards dismantling nuclear weapon, they were shown to the whole world that that was not the case. What to do next? I think in a high-level conference in 2018, that might be an opportunity, as it was suggested, to be relaxed, but look at get a critical review on what this in new treaty, these two realities of NPT and this ban treaty, and maybe thinking of the future to be realistically, if there's no output for Article 6, maybe to merge them together. Thank you.
Спасибо. Генерал-полковник Есин.
Thank you. General Colonel Yesin. Thank you very much. I will venture to remind that according to Article 6 of the NPT, negotiations on nuclear disarmament should involve not just the parties to the treaty that possess nuclear weapons, but all other parties. Now, in this connection, I believe that non-nuclear states could make a contribution to this process. They could come up with a draft of a treaty on total disarmament, including nuclear disarmament. I think this would do us more good than developing NPT. Now, Mr. Meyer mentioned that nuclear states continue to increase their nuclear arsenals. Well, sir, I challenge you to come up with specific figures to substantiate your point. As far as I know, both Russia and the US are reducing their arsenals, just like France and the UK. So claiming that all nuclear states tend to increase, well, look, upgrading is a different story, but they do upgrade, but they reduce their arsenals. Thank you. Dr. Maria Sultan.
Thank you, Anton. First of all, I would like to compliment. I'm Maria Sultan from South Asian Strategic Stability Institute, Pakistan. First of all, I would like to compliment the panel for highlighting the contradictions which the nuclear ban treaty specifies very clearly. I have just three short questions. First and foremostly, in the absence of a complete and general disarmament, which is verifiable or which is present internationally in the international non-proliferation as a core concept or as a treaty, one. Number two, the possibility and the increased drift of nuclear doctrines towards preemption. And number three, the most interesting fact is that the emphasis of the treaty on nuclear first use is in fact contradictory, given the fact that the primary purpose of the treaty is to look for actually banning nuclear weapons. Because at one level, nuclear first use or even a defensive nuclear deterrence posture envisages a nuclear use of a weapon. So how do you ensure a dialogue process, and what are those step-by-step possibilities which you can offer to nuclear weapon states, which are definitely at one side emphasizing and accepting nuclear use in a defensive posture, and on the other hand, you're expecting them to move forward on a process which itself is not clear, either theoretically, practically, or even in that sense, legally.
Maria, we have a time for the final question by Angela Kane, please.
Thank you very much. Senior Fellow at VCDNP and former official of the United Nations. We've heard the two sides of the story, and we've heard the controversies, as was already mentioned, and I don't really see that there's been any change in the position since the adoption of the Nuclear Ban Treaty in July. And what I fear is that we have about the same time elapsing before the second NPT review conference. And the difficulty I find with the NPT review conference is that they don't really review what happened in the previous years or in the previous REFCON, REFCONs. So my question is really to see how can it actually be approached. There doesn't seem to be any bridging. There doesn't seem to be any states that are willing to do the bridging. Izumi Nakamitsu, the High Representative for Disarmament Affairs, offered the assistance of the UN. Would it be possible to get the two sides, if I can call them as two sides, together to sort of say what has actually happened between the last REFCON, between 1995, 2000, 2010, the action plans that were adopted, what has actually happened? In the meantime, what has been achieved, what has not been achieved, and what are the possibilities for achieving what was agreed by consensus at that time?
Thank you, Angela. Now, every panelist has 2 minutes to respond to any question which was raised. Not more than that, because we have to finish the session on time. And I would suggest to start in reverse order. Oliver.
2 minutes. Let me try to be clear. I don't think that there's an expectation that the nuclear weapon states would, in any near future, endorse the ban treaty. That's clearly not the expectation here. But there has to be a way of talking about some of the issues that are not clearly defined yet in the ban treaty neither. I think that's important. And here I think the states in the middle, as I tried to say, may have a role in convening such a dialogue, not with a view to reconciling some of the differences, but at least to reaching a common understanding of some of the more problematic aspects in the ban treaty, but also, of course, with regard to lack of implementation of Article 6 under the NPT. Those are two sides of the same topic. One topic that may be useful to engage on is the conditions for nuclear disarmament. And we've heard today, again, a rather broad statement that the conditions are not ripe yet for nuclear disarmament. But I think it might be useful to have an attempt between some non-nuclear weapon states and nuclear weapon states to be more specific and to phrase this question differently. What would be the conditions under which nuclear weapon states might be willing to consider going down further? That seems to be a question that's evaded easily by the nuclear weapon states, and that may be one topic for such a dialogue.
Thank you. Bill.
Two brief comments with respect to points made by Ambassador Soltani and Angela Kane. First, with respect to Angela, I share your frustration about the so-called strengthened NPT review process. I think it would be worthwhile to contemplate, even at the PrepCom, which does not have a responsibility at this PrepCom to make recommendations, to perhaps make some statements regarding the contemporary situation, what has transpired in the past year. That's not without precedent, and it may be worthwhile. I think it also really is important to look carefully at the suggestion that Ambassador Berdinikov made about the potential to go back to the approach in 1995, where incidentally there was no consensus final document, because the president decided to invest his energies and the conference's energies on the three decisions and a resolution. So perhaps this is something that we may wish to focus on at the next review conference, concerned less with a consensus final document, but forging some more narrower statements where there can be a convergence, if not a consensus of views. My last point with respect to Ambassador Soltani, and I think he's correct about kind of archiving, if you will, the notion of a nuclear weapons convention. That was not for preordained. It was really a consequence of the nuclear weapons possessors and the nuclear weapon states boycotting the open-ended working group. And so you had countries such as Costa Rica, which were pioneers in promoting a convention, basically coming to the conclusion that in the absence of the nuclear weapons possessors, the only viable approach from their vantage point was the ban treaty.
John Carlson.
There's been several references to the wording of Article 6 and the need for nuclear disarmament to take place in the context of a treaty on general disarmament. I'd make the point that, of course, conventional arms imbalances are an important part of the overall strategic picture and need to be taken into account in nuclear disarmament. But in terms of most of the nuclear armed states, we're a long way from this being a priority because nuclear weapons numbers are so large. And I think in any step-by-step process, there's the possibility of running numbers down to a minimum credible deterrence and then looking at what might be done to go further before you get into a question of what needs to be done on the conventional front. In some regional context, we may already be at that situation. In South Asia, for instance, and I certainly think there that nuclear disarmament negotiations would have to be done in parallel with conventional force, confidence building, and limits and so forth. Thank you.
Спасибо. Михаил Иванович, 2 минуты.
Да, во-первых, я хочу успокоить
I want to give peace to Ambassador Sultanieh. The Convention on Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons has not been done away with. I assure you that in a few years we are going to see more negotiations on comprehensive convention that would make nuclear weapons illegal. The treaty is just the first step. And now, with regard to what Colonel Yassin said, I think it was very appropriate. We cannot be selective about the legally binding statements of the NPT. Mr. Carson suggested that nuclear disarmament should be a priority and full and complete disarmament should be left aside. We don't think it's right. Article 6 is not fulfilled in the part that deals with the development of a document on complete disarmament. In the nuclear disarmament, we've made a lot of progress over 30 years. We have eliminated 87% of our stockpiles. We only kept 13 or 14% of what we had 30 years ago. People just don't want to hear that. Angela invited us to look at the outcomes of every NPT review conference and look at what has been done between the conferences. At the conference in 2015, I have said several times, in 2010, Russia had 3,900 deployed warheads, 3,900. In 2015, we only had 582. Over 5 years, that is a 3-time decrease. And they're telling us that we are slow in the disarmament process. I think this has nothing to do with reality. This is pure propaganda that is completely unsubstantiated. The statement that nuclear disarmament is going slowly is very popular. People repeat it over and over again. And even my colleague has mentioned it as one of the reasons why non-nuclear states decided to develop a nuclear ban treaty. That's it. Let's say thank you to our panelists. Our next session will start at 2 o'clock, and we will deal with the security in Northeast Asia, where conflict potential is the highest today. Now lunch is ready. You should go to the restaurant on the first floor. Please don't